Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this kind of hazy day in Southern California. Today, you are joining us for a webinar on Hacking is on the Rise, Best Practices for Protecting Your Company. And we have an incredible group of presenters. Today, we have Cheryl Dunn-Soto. And Cheryl Dunn-Soto is of Franklin Soto LLP. She's a seasoned attorney with an insurance coverage and bad faith practice, focusing on representing corporate policyholders in disputes with their insurers. In addition to litigating insurance coverage disputes, Cheryl often analyzes and assists in resolving coverage issues pre-suit, including complex matters involving multiple policies and limits. She is particularly well-versed in the issues raised by manuscript policies such as D&O, E&O, and cyber policies. She serves as a chair of the Insurance/Bad Faith Law section of the San Diego County Bar Association and volunteers with the San Diego Volunteer Lawyer Program. She is admitted to practice law in California, New York, and Arizona. And we welcome Cheryl Dunn-Soto to the panel. In addition to that, we have Scott Palka. And Scott Palka is a partner and consulting CFO with PBO Advisory Group. Scott is responsible for the firm's quality assurance program, technical accounting, client requests, and director of PBO's project-based consulting and advisory services. Prior to joining PBO, Scott has served as a finance executive for both public and private companies ranging from $15 million to $1 billion in revenue. Scott has over 10 years consulting in the Big Four, where he specialized in leading engagements that required creative and time-sensitive application of economics, finance, statistics, and accounting in a wide range of critical, high-value business situations. And we have Grant Page, and Grant is the Director of Client Success for centrexIT. Grant is responsible for aligning client technological requirements with business objectives in order to maximize our ROI and overall value on IT investments. He brings over 15 years experience managing client IT operational strategies, partner relationships, and has a proven track record of delivering results. We're really pleased to have all of you join us today on our webinar. And I just wanted to let you know a little bit of housekeeping items before we get started. You can see our wonderful panelists up on the screen above. There's a chat section in the area. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat and we will make sure to get your questions answered either during the presentation or after, depending on how much time we have. And today's agenda is, this will also be recorded. This whole presentation will be recorded, so you don't need to take notes, and we will provide you with a link to the recording after the webinar is complete, sometime in the next day or so that you have access to go back in and look at all of the incredible information that's going to be shared today. And so on the agenda, we are going to talk about IT cybersecurity best practices, tried and true corporate habits that keep your finances safe, and top tips for maximizing your cyber insurance coverage. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Grant, and he's going to take it away.
Thank you so much, Fran, and thank you to the PBO team for putting on today's webinar. Much appreciated. And of course, thank you all for joining today in this session, and we hope it brings some value and awareness around what we can do in small to medium-sized businesses to help best protect ourselves for our finances, our security, our legal aspects, our insurance. So really excited to get underway here. So let's get started with the next slide on why we're talking about this. Why is this relevant? And we're really seeing an uptick in attacks through COVID. COVID has unfortunately leveled the playing field for a lot of cyber criminals to take advantage of small to medium-sized businesses that may or may not have been properly prepared for a work from home environment or working in a segregated type infrastructure. So there are a lot more vulnerabilities being uncovered and exploited by these cyber criminals. So we're hearing this in the news, right? We're seeing the Colonial Pipelines, the JBSs, the Kaseya's, and especially here in San Diego County, we're hearing about scripts. And we're hearing some very big price tags attached with these different names. So of course, that's gonna grab your attention in those headlines. For example, with scripts, we don't have an exact number on it, but we do know that they were down for over 3 weeks when their systems were compromised. And we don't know the details beyond that, but 3 weeks is devastating to any business, let alone a hospital trying to take care of patients and inpatient, outpatient care. So why are we hearing about all these attacks? Well, there is that overall uptick that I just mentioned, and there are these big price tags. But what we're not hearing about in the news is if we go to the next slide, we're actually being extremely vulnerable to attacks as small businesses. So we are hearing these larger names because they're making the headlines with those big price tags, but in reality, close to 60% of all cyber attacks are targeting small businesses. So we may not hear about those small businesses in the news, but that is where the majority of cyber criminals are focusing their attacks. If we go to the next slide, we'll see, well, why? What are they going after? Why are they going after small businesses? It's to specifically target their employees. Our employees are our greatest assets, but they're also our greatest vulnerabilities. And without proper awareness and training, their negligence, whether they know it or not, they are leaving the companies vulnerable to attack. So it's really up to us to make sure that our contractors, our employees, anyone that might have access to our corporate information that underlies our clients' information takes those extra steps to make sure that we raise that awareness around what we can do for best practices, both with our internal employees, our vendors, our contractors, and so on. Because if you look at this slide here, over half of the attacks are originated due to negligible employees or contractors. So it's all about raising that awareness to make sure that, hey, we want to make sure you understand what the risks are out there. And we also want to complement that with a few other things that we're going to talk about here shortly. So going to the next slide, we'll provide an example of, well, what is this to me? Why is it relevant to me as a small, medium-sized business owner, executive employee, etc.? Here's an example of a small business that had 250 records compromised. Well, let's bring that down to earth. What does that mean? Well, say, for example, you have 25 clients, and of those 25 clients, they also have 10 personally identifiable records that are their clients, or maybe some information within your client database. It's really easy to see what 250 records could cost. In this example, it has a price tag of 120 grand. 120 grand that's not budgeted is devastating to a small business. And it's not just the recovery of the data. There are hard costs, there are soft costs, and there are reputation costs that come with the cyber attack. So it's not only recovering your data, but it's also making sure that you have the team that can recover the data through the forensics analysis to see what other gaps you might have in your security controls, the crisis management that comes with an attack, the notifying of all of your clients of a potential attack, the credit monitoring, and other things that you must set up once that is revealed that you may have been vulnerable to an attack. So it adds up very quickly, and we want to make sure that we do our due diligence in the business community to help raise that awareness and strengthen our muscle as an overall business community to protect ourselves together. So going to the next slide, we'll see, why is this shifting as a mindset? Why are we still talking about this? Yes, it's still relevant. Yes, we see the price tags, but in the IT sense of things, there has been an instrumental shift in the way that we approach how to protect our information. Even as late as 5 years ago, the idea behind protecting our data was design it not to fail. We have to make sure our systems never, ever fail. and we have to prevent every single attack from ever coming into our network. Well, fast forward to today, we understand that that mindset is no longer realistic. You can't protect yourself against every single attack. There is a new attack generated every second of every day. Cyber criminals are looking for every way to get into your system. So today it's all about resiliency and assuming compromise. So it's about how do I keep my data protected as best as I can and dispersed throughout multiple different media and systems, so that way when I am attacked, I know how to restore quickly, recover, make sure my information is secure as possible, and respond to those attacks as quickly as possible. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see, well, what are the top actions that I can take away from today as a small to medium-sized business? And really, it comes down to there are preventative measures that we can take that we'll get into a little bit more in detail here in a couple of slides. And there's the overall restoration and recovery process of my data and my business and my overall operations as a company, right? So there's the technology protection side. Those are when we can geek out as IT people and talk about the specific things we can do in a network. But there's also access control. There are checks and balances within our company environments that we can instill, both technological and procedural. There are trainings to make sure that our employees, as mentioned in the couple of slides before, that their awareness is increased and they understand what to look out for. And then with that restoration and recovery, there are policies. There are disaster recovery procedures and policies. There's a business continuity plan, what to do when a disaster happens, who is in charge, who calls those sort of things, and where do we restore from? How do we get our systems back up and running? And we'll get into a little bit more detail here in these next couple of slides. So talking about the technological controls, right? There are some quick wins out there with different platforms, such as email gateway services that help filter any kind of malicious spam, right? It's looking to block anything that's known malicious right off the bat. There are different encryption services to make sure that your PII, protected information, personally identifiable information, is protected. There's EDR, that's endpoint detection and response, to make sure that if there is a known compromise on your environment, it's quarantined, isolated, or remediated across the network. And there is unified endpoint management or mobile device management, making sure that your devices are covered, they're known, they're accounted for, your software is known, it's identified, it's covered, it's accounted for. It's about knowing what's in your environment and protecting it as best you can with a continual improvement process in place. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll go more in detail on educating your employees. So here's a prime example of an email that we actually had internally here at centrexIT. James Desson is our president, and this was sent to an employee asking for something ASAP. In this case, it was a phone number. So one thing to take away from this slide is always suspect an email with urgent requests, especially for money or personal information. So let's go through 1 through 7 very quickly here. Right off the bat, what's suspicious about this kind of email? Well, James Desson, if you look at the email address it came from, it's officialnotifier@gmail.com. It's not coming from centrexIT.com. That's your first giveaway. Number 2, it says external there. What we're recommending a lot of our clients do is turn on this notifier that if it's outside of your company domain email, it's automatically going to have a little notifying label saying it's an external email. So automatically I know that if James is emailing me this, it's not from James, it's from outside my organization. Number 3, hello, very generic salutation. There's no name, there's nothing else. It's just, hey, hi, hello. Number 4, it's asking for personally identifiable information. In this case, it wants a phone number. Number 5, the I is lowercase, poor grammar. Number 6, ASAP, I want it right now. Whatever it is, it has to be now. Sense of urgency, why? And finally, number 7, in the signature, Centrex Data Corporation is not our signature, it's centrexIT. So there are 7 giveaways in just this one email to let me know that this is bogus and I should not trust it or click on it or respond to it or anything whatsoever. And there are a lot of different programs out there that we can talk about more in depth of how to continue to raise that awareness for our employees, but this is just a prime example. Going to the next slide. So talking about that level of access control, right? There are a number of different things we can do as small to medium-sized businesses to protect ourselves when it comes to strong passwords, or the latest school of thought, a strong passphrase. The longer the better, and the easier for you to remember as the end user, but the harder for a cyber criminal to crack because it might be 27 characters long. Multi-factor authentication. That's a simple push to a separate device from whenever you're trying to log into any kind of system. That reduces your risk considerably as an organization. A virtual private network, having that secure connection to your systems. Mobile device management, making sure that you account for all of those different devices within your company network, whether they're personally owned by the employees or company owned. And finally, single sign-on, making sure that all of those credentials are protected within a centralized location that can be securely changed regularly, and along with your passphrases, ideally changed every 90 days as a best practice to make sure that you're regularly keeping that as a housekeeping item. So that way, if your password ever is compromised, you have the discipline of changing it so it's always up to date and no cyber criminal who may have gotten a hold of it a year ago can continue to access your precious data. Going to the next slide. So policies and procedures, they're always not as fun to do, but they are absolutely necessary. A business continuity plan is absolutely the best thing you can do in addition to an information security policy when we're talking about securing our data. What do we do when a disaster strikes? A disaster does not have to be a pandemic. It doesn't have to be a natural disaster. It can be, we had a cyber criminal access our systems. We have a ransomware attack. We don't have access to our systems. What do we do? Who's in charge? What's the triage? And test this policy, test this disaster recovery at least once a year. That is the best practice, because then you're building that muscle as an organization to, if we refer back to the previous slides, that assume compromise will happen. Okay, what do we do when it happens so we can be up and running as quickly as possible when that does happen? So that helps you with overall incident response. And bring your own device. A lot of employees have their own mobile devices. Like we talked about with mobile device management, there are the employee-owned devices and the company-owned devices, and we want to make sure that our employees are aware of what the risks are of having that company data on their personal device. They have to understand there are certain responsibilities with having that information on their device, and there needs to be some level of control and expectation around what to do with that information. And frequent backups. Cannot express this slide more so. This is probably the most important thing you can do as an organization, is ensure that your backups are regular, they are tested, and often restored. And that can be part of your disaster recovery plan at least once a year if you want to do a full system restore, but at least periodically doing a simple test restore. And this slide shows the 3-2-1 backup rule. So we recommend clients have at least 3 copies of their data on 2 different types of storage media for redundancy, and at least 1 offsite geographic location. And when you restore those backups to the desired systems, the idea is to have 0 recoverability errors. Now, we understand in IT, 0 is not always achievable, but we strive for that, and we want to regularly test that, because the more we test, the more we can reduce those errors, and should an attack happen, the better off we are to restore and be up and running sooner. So let's talk about overall top 5 recommendations we just talked about, right? So number 1, virus, spam, malicious content protection. Number 2, overall access controls with those strong passphrases, multi-factor authentication, virtual private network, mobile device management, single sign-on. Number 3, regularly training your employees You can do that through email phishing campaigns, attack simulations. There are a number of different platforms out there that help with that. Number 4, policies and procedures for your organization to test and abide by. And number 5, frequent backups, frequent tests, frequent restorations. I'm very slow in saying that because it is extremely important and you want to make sure that you do it on a regular basis. So that sums up the IT side and best practices. We're here to help and look forward to some questions. And with that, I think we're going to be handing it over to
Grant,
Scott.
there is one question that you could probably answer. It says, if all of our data is in the cloud, do we need to do backups?
That is a fantastic question. Yes, the answer is yes, because no matter where your data resides, if it's a public cloud, private cloud, on-premise, you want to assume compromise in no matter what environment that is. So ideally, you have your backups in a separate location. It could be even in a different data store in that cloud, but ideally, you have it in a different public cloud environment, even if it's in a cold format, which means you would just have to restore. It would take longer, but you're diversifying your risk. If you all have it in one environment, no matter where that environment is, if it's attacked by ransomware and it's encrypted, you don't have access to it, it doesn't matter where it's located. Great question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, and with that, we're turning it over to Scott Palka to talk about the financial asset security and what we can do to protect our financial data.
Thanks, Fran, and thanks, Grant. Yeah, one thing I'd like to say, one of the most insightful things I think I learned from Grant's presentation was that employees are the main cause of the problems, whether they know it or not. I think in every financial diversion or theft of company assets I've ever seen, employees were always involved, whether they knew it or not. And so with that, if we could flip to the next slide. I want to start with our top recommendations. Multi-factor confirmation and two-factor, I just can't stress that enough. And it doesn't mean it has to be via computer. It can be as simple as sending an email to somebody and then following up with a phone call. We've had people, when they've sent us their ACH instructions, we've Zoomed them and said, hey, you know, we know this is you, show us your instructions. It's pretty simple stuff, pretty important. The use of templates for electronic funds payments, which are ACHs and wires, and that basically just means that in order for somebody to send a wire, if it's not on an approved template, they would have to get somebody else to approve it. You want to be especially careful when you're using things like Venmo, PayPal, Veeam, cryptocurrency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that big companies would not use because there is simply zero internal control over these particular products. They're extremely handy, they're extremely slick, they're extremely fast, and they're extremely easy to send money to the wrong person. Keep an eye on customer billing portals for those of you that have bigger clients. We've seen situations where there's been the admin of the portal also is the person that had complete control over the portal and also got all the notifications when the portal was changing. There would have been absolutely nothing from stopping that admin from changing the remit to in the portal and having millions of dollars sent somewhere else. They didn't, but certainly the control wasn't there. And then also, when you're doing electronic transfers, and we all probably remember the old days of PayPal where they would send you 4 cents or 25 cents, and then you'd have to independently go back and verify that you got it. You know, everybody thought that was kind of silly. I've got a lot of the international clients I work with, they always send test wires, even when they know they're getting the instructions, because they just want to take absolutely no chances, even for an inadvertent keying error in the wire transfer setup. Next slide is, so this is the recent trend in payment theft. I have seen this particular thing executed 4 times in the last year. The total losses to these 4 clients approached about $1 million. The hacker gains access to the vendor or the customer email system, and they figure out by going through the email who to contact. They send a message from that company's email to you asking you to change the remit instructions. Where this is extremely difficult to detect just by looking at it is, unlike the email Grant said where it was obvious that didn't come from the company, these are coming from that person's email box. It's just that person isn't sending them. Then they create an email rule so that if you reply or send this person an email that goes into another place other than the inbox, it goes deep into the structure. And then the email you get back that says, oh yeah, everything's cool, is coming from the hacker. And that's why this has been effective, is you've been hacked, the communications are coming from the actual email account, everything looks and feels authentic. So if you don't independently verify that information, that money is going to get sent. We've had it sent places, Gabon, Africa, different ACHs, and realistically, if you don't detect that within 5 seconds of it happening, that money is probably gone for good. And Cheryl's going to talk about the insurance aspect of that, but I'll just say, I'd rather not have to file an insurance claim and have the money than have to hope that my coverage is solid on that. Can we have the next one, Michael? So what can be done? And I think this is everything Grant said applies here to financial, is you independently verify sensitive vendor and customer data, especially payment instructions. If a vendor all of a sudden says, hey, can you change the ship to this gold bar that I'm buying to somewhere else? You probably want to be a little skeptical on that. Most companies don't change their ship tos in their bank accounts regularly, just because it's a pain and it's a process. Larger accounts, we've seen the vendors basically asking for a bank confirmation that the EFT is actually from the company. I just have to say, this sounds good, and I think it's really good, except it also takes a really long time because it's really hard to figure out if you got a Wells Fargo who you even asked to send that kind of a letter. You want to make sure that you activate controls over EFTs, again, using the recurring templates. You want to require authorization to change the template, initiate a free form. And I think Grant would agree with this. Access control is everything. If you can control the access, you probably have done about everything you can do to be as protected as you can be. Next one. So things you can do. You can implement positive pay. This mainly applies to checks. It's a convenient way to make sure that you mitigate the possibility of check fraud on your account. That only really helps if the person reviewing the positive pay actually reviews it on a timely basis. Seen plenty of clients that implemented positive pay and never bothered to follow up on exceptions, and that's the same thing as not implementing positive pay. You want to be monitoring your bank account every day. People think that their money's safe in the bank. I just have to tell you, depending on the bank, it's not that difficult to generate an ACH to take money out of your bank account. Getting your bank account number and your routing number is extremely simple, especially if you ever sent me a check, I would have it. You want to make sure that you post cash to the accounts receivable daily and follow up on any strange overdue amounts right away. And this is especially true if you have customers that pay like clockwork, like an Amazon or an Apple or an IBM or Microsoft, where they're using portals and they've got automated rules. They always pay on the due date. There is just, I've never seen an exception in 5 years of working with that. If all of a sudden you see, hey, that thing went 1 or 2 days past due, that probably means somebody changed the portal instructions. So you want to be very skeptical when anything changes like that. And the test transaction in these systems is equivalent of the multi-factor authentication. Again, a small random amount and ask for the recipient to confirm what the amount is going to at least make sure that you've got the correct instructions set up in your system. So the reality factors. So now we get back to the practical side of finance. I find it very difficult to have safety and security and a bulletproof system and really fast, cost-effective staff time on the other. There is a time trade-off between convenience and security. Extra measures are going to require extra resources to implement. You're going to likely need to increase your security spend, and that doesn't necessarily mean hard dollars. As Grant said, it could mean soft costs. And you just have to realize that the minute something becomes urgent and you've decided that you got to do whatever it takes to get it done, you're probably violating all of your internal control and policies in the first place. So you just want to be really careful to not let the tyranny of the urgent dominate your daily planning. You want to review your internal controls and make sure they're operating correctly. Segregation of duties is, to say it's far more challenging in smaller organizations, probably an understatement. I think Fran will comment on that too. It's almost impossible to have segregation of duties in smaller organizations. A larger client found out, because he was talking to me the other day, and this is a very big company, they're like 20+ million in revenue, and he said he noticed that he was signing a lot less checks, and there's only 2 check signers, him and the COO. So he just figured the COO was signing the checks. The COO just figured the CEO was signing the checks. So they had a conversation. Well, they found out that the controller, who didn't have check signing authority, was the admin on the online banking account. And she just decided to turn on ACH functionality. And she just decided to paint a lot of vendors with ACH with absolutely zero authorization and zero oversight. Now, fortunately, nothing bad happened, But I told the president, I said, I can just waltz over to her terminal, punch in 122000247, which is the Wells routing number, in my bank account, and I'm off to the races. And by the time you figure that out, you'll never figure it out. It'll be an unreconciled difference in a bank reconciliation. And you can't, on these cybersecurities, and I'll go with Grant, you can't fail to consider the possibility of an inside job, even if it looks like a hack. It could be an inside job. I have seen clients, I've done a lot of forensics, most of the large losses are not caused by external criminals in the smaller companies. They're caused by the internal staff. And it's just really important to say, unless you're a huge company, you're not going to get a $10 million ransomware attack because they know you don't have $10 million. So they've got better things to do. It's a lot easier to try to get into your email, see if you've got Portal, try to get you to send them money. Again, it's really easy to steal money from somebody when they're sending it to you. That's pretty simple. I mean, that's a lot easier than trying to take it because they're giving it to you. And the next one. So finally, and if there's a call to action, you want to make sure you have access to authentic documents such as bank statements, credit card statements. Paperless is convenient, but fairly easy to manipulate. The largest fraud I've seen in the last 5 years came from somebody who had access to the company's credit card account, and they were getting the PDFs, and this company spent probably 35 to 40 million a month on their credit card, very large company. This person was basically using the company credit card for a lifestyle of the rich and famous, getting the PDFs of the credit cards, using PDF Creator to change the vendor name from, Las Vegas, Nevada Sands to FedEx, and then resending the PDF with a false email to the controller who thought they were getting it from the bank. So you just have to make sure that you're getting authentic documents whenever possible. We've seen millions in fraud just doing that. This particular one got by the owners, it got by the executives, and it got by a Big Four accounting firm who didn't ask for authentic credit card statements. They just went with the PDFs the company gave them. You want to look to confirm payments are being made timely, as some agency won't notify you when they're late. And now this is an important one, and as my colleague Michael said, it's a little confusing. One of the things I've seen where, again, and this is internal theft using the computer system, is companies making property taxes and estimated tax payments. You don't usually get receipts, and if somebody takes your payroll tax deposit and they send it to themselves instead of sending it where it belongs, it could take more than a year before you get a notice from the IRS that, hey, you've got a problem. These are places where nobody's looking, and again, prevention is obviously the best thing you can have, but if you can't have prevention, you at least want to try to have detection. And if you don't have timely detection, you probably don't have detection. So you just have to really look and say, where's money going where nobody's going to tell me if they don't get it? This is one of the reasons why I don't get overly worried about people stealing people's paychecks, is because those employees generally, if they don't get paid on payday by like 5 o'clock in the morning, at 5:01, they're calling somebody saying, hey, where's my paycheck? So the prime examples here are sales tax deposits, 401k tax deposits, payroll tax deposits, and income tax deposits, because these places just will not tell you, hey, by the way, you're past due, you're overdue anytime soon. And I believe that is the end of my section, Fran. And so while I'm hoping you never need the tips that Cheryl's going to give you, I encourage you to listen very carefully, because the one theft was denied by the insurance company because they said, well, since our system wasn't hacked and we just voluntarily sent money to the wrong place, they basically said, that's stupid, but it's not covered. Wasn't big enough to litigate, but I would have loved to have Cheryl take them on and see what she could have done for us.
Well, unfortunately, Scott, there's probably nothing that I could have done. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so you guys have heard great tips about how to reduce the likelihood of a successful cyber attack. I'm going to talk about how to reduce the cost when the inevitable occurs. As Grant talked about, small businesses are really the focus of many of these hacking attacks and cyber attacks. And we can go to the next slide and see that in one survey, actually 64% of the small and medium-sized businesses that were surveyed said they actually had no cyber insurance. And then surprisingly, 5% said they weren't really sure if they had cyber insurance coverage. I can tell you that if you're not sure if you have cyber insurance coverage, you very likely do not. And you, in particular, don't have the robust coverage that you would have if you had a standalone cyber policy. You may have an endorsement that provides you very limited amounts of coverage, but you're not going to have that robust coverage from a standalone policy. And in the next slide, we'll see some of the coverages that you could expect to see in a robust standalone policy. On the left-hand side, you'll see coverage for many of the losses that Grant talked about: the forensic investigation, data restoration costs, notification costs, which can start in the hundreds of thousands and go up to millions of dollars. Also, ransom, we'll talk about that in a minute. On the right-hand side, you'll see some losses that are considered liability type losses that you will not find coverage for under a typical policy. There could be coverage for contractual fines and penalties, and also the cost of dealing with regulatory agencies that oversee these data breach laws and regulations. And you may find yourself in a regulatory investigation that could cost you a lot of money. So let's go to the next slide. When you are considering purchasing insurance coverage, or perhaps you are getting ready to renew your policy, the first step you need to do is assess your cyber risk. And I have to think that some companies don't actually do that, even though it seems very obvious. They don't do it before they purchase their policy. And here's some of the questions that you need to ask. One is, do you just have financial data on your system, or do you have personally identifiable information? Do you have health information or credit card information? P.F. Chang's years ago apparently didn't ask themselves that question because they paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a policy that didn't cover them for the PCI fines and assessments that they were responsible for after there was a data breach and all their customers' credit card information was disclosed and accessed. Also ask yourself, where's the data stored? As Grant talked about, more and more employees are using their own devices, whether it's their cell phones or their personal laptops, to conduct your business. Make sure that you understand how significant that risk is for you, and make sure that your policy covers it accordingly, because not every policy is going to cover something that happens on your employee's device. Also, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail, but think about the risk that you face from your third-party vendors. Do they have access to your data? If so, that's a huge risk. Do you face claims for bodily injury or property damage? Would you be able to actually measure your loss of income in the event you can't access your data? If so, you need to look for coverage that will cover you for that. And also, as Scott talked about, do you initiate wire transfers? That's a very important question. So let's go to the next slide. Once you've assessed your risk, you want to really participate in the process. You need to talk to your broker, read the sample policies, ask for sample policies and read them, and ask your broker a lot of questions. And the first question I would ask, and there are a number of questions you could ask, I've kind of narrowed it down to a few, ask about ransomware coverage. So this coverage is often offered, and it is really great because it'll not just pay a ransom, but it will actually help you figure out how to buy Bitcoin. So let's say there's a $100,000 ransom demand and you have to pay in Bitcoin by tomorrow. Are you going to know how to purchase Bitcoin and get that paid? Probably not, but your insurance company will. What's important to understand with ransomware attacks, though, is that, and coverage for them, is insurers really don't want to pay the ransom. And so while the policy you purchase may very well have ransom coverage, you may have a sublimit. So you may have $1 million in limits, you may have a $25,000 sublimit for a ransom payment. So make sure you get an idea, like as Scott said, you're not going to get a request for $1 million if you're a small business, but perhaps the ransom request may be 100,000. So make sure you feel comfortable with the sublimits that you're offered. The next slide is exactly what Scott was talking about. So I cannot tell you how many clients have called me and said, oh, we made a voluntary wire transfer. It was because of a fraudulent email from a vendor or a customer. And so we made a claim under our policy, and we were told we have computer fraud coverage, we have internet fraud coverage, we have all kinds of fraud coverage, and yet we were denied coverage. And the problem is that so often these policies don't cover voluntary transfers. So you need to ask your broker, will this cover a voluntary transfer? oftentimes the policies will say, well, if someone gets into your computer system and initiates a fraudulent request to the bank that there be a transfer, then there'll be coverage, but there won't be coverage for a voluntary transfer. So make sure, and even brokers don't understand this. I've had potential clients say, oh, well, my broker told me I have this coverage, and I have to tell them, well, I'm very sorry, but you don't. Let's go to the next slide. So oftentimes, the policy will, not oftentimes, but it's certainly possible. I've seen a number of policies where the policy only covers you in the event there's a disclosure of the confidential information on your system. Well, your company faces liability if that data is merely accessed. So you want to make sure that you have a more broadly written policy that actually covers you when you're liable for accessing confidential information. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said before, assess your ability to prove business interruption loss. Sometimes there are companies like law firms that, it'd be hard for my firm to prove how much money we lost in a day if we couldn't access our data, and it probably wouldn't be that much even if we could prove it. But let's say that your company is the kind that is very easy to prove. If we can't operate for a day, this is how much we lose. Well, then you really want to look into business interruption loss coverage. And there are two types. The first is regular business interruption loss coverage. So for example, in the Scripps incident, if they had to turn patients away for 3 weeks and those patients went elsewhere, they didn't reschedule their procedures, they went elsewhere for those procedures, they could probably pretty easily show that during that 3-week period, they actually lost X millions of dollars. So hopefully they have a cyber policy and it covers their business interruption loss. The second type of business interruption loss coverage is dependent business interruption loss coverage. And a good example of that is with respect to the Kaseya incident. So Coop is a Swedish grocery store, and they don't use Kaseya software, but their vendor used Kaseya software. So their vendor was suffered from the ransomware attack, and as a result, Coop could not use their cash tills. And so they had to close their grocery store for a few days because they couldn't use their cash registers. So that's a very good example of being able to rely on dependent business interruption loss coverage in order to make up for those lost revenues during that time period. Next slide. So think about too with vendors how vulnerable you are because of things that they may or may not do. So these are the logos of 8 companies that were involved in significant data breaches that involved vendors. And my favorite one is Target, because Target, their customers and data was actually accessed through an HVAC contractor. So think about all the vendors, payroll providers and other vendors that you deal with who have access to your systems or your information, and realize that you face liability if your customers' data is accessed because of their mistake. You face liability. And if you're a vendor servicing these companies, then you face liability because that company is going to come back to you and say it's your fault that this data breach occurred. So you need to make sure, whichever end of the equation you're on, and maybe you're on both ends, you need to make sure that you have coverage for the liability that you're going to face. Next slide. Okay, so bodily injury and property damage coverage. I was hearing about this years ago with cyber policies, and it was kind of like, why would you need that? Well, more and more devices are now connected to the internet. Think about appliances and medical devices and cars, gas pumps. There are all kinds of devices that if they're hacked, you can only imagine the bodily injury and property damage that could occur. I heard recently that in Florida, there's a water treatment plant. They were hacked, and the hackers basically increased the amount of lye that was going into the water. Now, if people were drinking that water with too much lye, obviously they'd become very sick. That didn't occur. They caught it in time, but this is a very good example of how bodily injury can occur from a hacking event. Oftentimes, there are exclusions for this type of injury or damage. So if you can foresee that such injury or damage may occur in your situation, then you should talk to your broker about getting this type of coverage. Also, you definitely, no matter what, you want coverage for bodily injury in the form of emotional distress, because that's always been a component of a privacy claim that's associated with a data breach. So also, you want to ask your broker whether or not there are exclusions that are basically going to preclude coverage because you're negligent in maintaining your system. As you can imagine, your negligent maintenance of your system may very well be the cause of a hacking event or a data breach. So you do not want these types of exclusions in your policy. Let's go to the next slide. So in addition to being able to negotiate coverages and exclusions, it's also important to realize that there are other items you can negotiate, particularly with cyber policies, because they're not standardized. They're more like D&O and E&O policies, but they're not even quite like those, because even D&O and E&O are, fairly standardized as far as what they cover. And cyber policies run the gamut. You have some that include everything but the kitchen sink, and some that don't cover very much at all. But the other thing, though, with these policies is because the insurers are still trying to figure out the limits that they're going to offer and what exactly they're going to cover and how they're going to cover it, there's a lot of room for negotiation. So as I was talking about before with sublimits, make sure, a lot of times insurers, when they don't want to really cover something, they will agree to cover it, but they'll give you a really low sublimit. So always negotiate the highest limits and sublimits that you're able to get and to afford. Also, try to get lower deductibles. And arbitration provisions. I could spend an hour talking about arbitration provisions, but believe me, you don't want that in your policy. Insurers that have arbitration provisions are even more unreasonable than insurers that don't. So negotiate those out of any policy that you want to purchase. Also, get the insurer to approve your crisis response team ahead of time. The last thing you want to be doing in the midst of a data breach or a ransomware event is to be interviewing lawyers and public relations teams and IT and forensics teams. You want those in place beforehand, and you want to know that they're going to be there at a moment's notice. And it's very important that you have your insurance company approve them beforehand. Let's go to the next slide. So once you've procured your policy, it's very easy to take it and put it on the shelf. Or as I say now, you drag it from your email folder inbox to some other folder on your computer and just forget about it. But it's very important that you take the time to look it over, familiarize yourself with it, and keep reminding yourself of the requirements of that policy. For example, you probably made representations on your application about how you maintain your system. Well, you need to make sure you know what those representations were and that you do what you said you were going to do. The first thing an insurance company is going to do when you make a claim is look at your application and see if there's any way they can say that you aren't complying with what you said that you would. Also be aware of any downloading and installation instruction or requirements of software. So I had a client come in a few years ago that had made a claim that should have been covered by the policy. It was a voluntary wire transfer. However, they had not installed software that was a condition to there being coverage. So even though it was a legitimate claim, they gave the insurer a legitimate reason for denying the claim because they didn't comply with the condition precedent to coverage. Finally, be aware of there will be a reporting requirement, so be aware of the reporting requirement. I've seen policies that require a data breach be reported within 3 days of discovering it. I've seen some that are 30 days of discovering it. But even if you have a 30-day period for reporting, remember that any expenses that you incur during the time that you haven't reported it will not be covered by the insurer. They have to consent to your expenses. So don't run out and hire your approved defense team and your IT people, incur hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then report 29 days later, oh, I had this claim and here's my hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of receipts. And the insurance company will tell you, well, that's great, but we're sorry, we don't owe you anything because you didn't get our consent to incurring those particular costs. So that takes us to my 5 recommendations. Before you start out purchasing insurance, assess your cyber risk. Then do your homework, talk to your broker, read the policies, make sure you understand what you're purchasing and that it covers your risk. Then negotiate coverage and all the other terms that can affect the amount and extent of your coverage. And then understand what your duties are and comply with them so you don't give the insurance company a reason to deny your claim. And finally, work with a knowledgeable broker. Not all brokers are created equally. And in the cyber world, many brokers will say, oh, sure, I can sell you a cyber policy, but do they really understand what they're selling? Make sure that you work with someone who really understands what cyber insurance is all about.
Thank you so much. There was a question that came in, Cheryl. So if some of our clients start to do their homework and their policy is maybe not up to par with some of your recommendations, what do you recommend?
Well, I recommend that they first look at who their broker is and determine whether or not their broker really understands cyber insurance. And, I would suggest they look around and see if they can't find a broker who they feel really has the qualifications in that area. And then I would reach out to them and have them many brokers will do a free assessment, and they will just literally go through the policy and say, here's where I see all the weaknesses, and here's what's good about your policy, and I think there's a better product out there, and let me quote this for you. So I would say find a really good broker and have them review your policy and give their recommendations.
Okay, excellent. And then we've got a few questions for you, Grant. This question says, you listed several IT security tips. What do you recommend is the first thing to get started?
Yeah, great question. And I would say off the bat, kind of what we talked about already, make sure you test your backups. Make sure you have multiple copies of your backups. That I cannot stress that enough. Number one. Number two, train your people. Try to make a point of a culture of learning, of engaging with your employees, helping them raise their awareness, let them know it's okay if you don't know these things, but let's get together and improve as a team to raise that awareness. Some quick wins would be adding that little external note on the outbound emails that we gave that example of in the prior slide. And turning on the multi-factor authentication. That's a simple, fairly low-cost way to significantly reduce your risk. And Scott and Cheryl, everything that they just talked about today is extremely relevant on what you need to do for the different internal controls, especially financially, like Scott was talking about, with those checks and balances, and then making sure that you do review your cyber and policy, or if you don't have one, definitely get one. Definitely get one. I mean, without a doubt, if you didn't learn anything from today, please get a cyber policy, whatever limit that is, just at least get something in place because it is on the rise. In fact, we're seeing a trend in our clients where their clients are requiring them to increase their cyber limits. And Lloyd's, one of the big underwriters for the cyber insurance policies, are actually coming down with more stringent requirements and checks on your systems and your infrastructure and your network. And they're making it very, very granular on what are you doing to protect your information. Because guess what? They're paying out a lot of money with this increase in attacks. So they want to make sure that the clients of theirs are doing everything possible to mitigate that risk.
Wow. And I think you mentioned this, but there's another question. How long and how often should we be doing those backups?
Yeah, really the arithmetic that I recommend that a client or any business do is, Cheryl mentioned this, what's the cost of downtime? What does 1 hour of downtime cost my organization? If I understand that math, then I can work backwards from there and say, okay, if 1 hour costs me millions of dollars, I probably need to take a backup every 5 minutes of my data, right? How much of that data do you need to be able to restore, and how quickly do I need to restore it? So if I'm down for a week, and that's going to cost me $10 million. Now I understand what kind of budget I need to have in place to have those redundancies to not lose that kind of production. So understanding how much downtime will cost me will help me create that budget of how redundant my backups and my systems need to be in order to recover quickly from an attack.
Excellent. And here's another one. It says, I have employees with different levels of experience. Do you have recommendations on how I can teach them the difference between a phishing email and a regular email?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the example I provided today, there are examples online. Even if you just do a quick search of examples of phishing emails, don't try to go too far into the phishing email world. You don't want to come across anything malicious. But there are examples out there of just showing those what to look out for, those top tips, right? Those top 7 things that we just talked about together. And like I mentioned earlier, just promoting a culture of learning and sharing that, whether it's over an internal webinar or a gathering during lunch as a team or something like that, where maybe it's fun and engages the people and it makes it more entertaining, but also very valuable to help raise that awareness.
Oh, that's a great idea for just continuing to reinforce a company culture of mindfulness when it comes to security. Do we still have Mr. Polka on the line?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. We have a question for you. It says, what is one of the things I can do to protect my financial assets?
I think the most important thing you can do is prepare a comprehensive access risk threat assessment. And that starts with the IT infrastructure. It goes to all your financial systems, and then really it dovetails into getting the insurance coverage analysis to make sure that if you think you have a significant risk, you have coverage. I've seen clients inadvertently almost create self-inflicted ransomware because their controller or their senior financial person leaves, and all of a sudden nobody knows the admin password of the QuickBooks company file, and all of a sudden you can't access your own data, and it's a self-inflicted wound. So I mean, just, I don't want people to go home paranoid, but I just got to say, you just can't be too careful, and you can't know too much when you're in a small company. The buck stops with the owner. And if the owner isn't comfortable with that, the owner should probably consider retaining or engaging people that can assist in doing these analyses to make sure that they're covered and that they can probably sleep better at night.
Okay, thank you. And then Cheryl, we have a question. Do umbrella policies blanket over the top of a cyber policy?
Well, it's going to depend on the umbrella policy, but the typical umbrella policy will not. In fact, I haven't seen an umbrella policy specifically written over a cyber policy. It's certainly possible, but I don't know that they're really doing that at this time. So your standard one will not.
Okay. And then another question for you, I think, how do you ensure that the insurer and the broker are a good fit for your business and that the broker is financially stable? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think if you work with a bigger broker, the bigger broker company, they're going to have, they're going to be more stable. Yeah, I think you sometimes might be concerned about working with a smaller broker that maybe doesn't have the assets. But I think what's most important is just researching them and asking them questions about their experience and how often do they place cyber policies and how many different carriers do they work with, and just really ask a lot of questions and gather information and make a decision accordingly.
Okay, and then we have another question that says, what usually triggers a claim denial in a cybersecurity claim?
Misrepresentations on an application, that's a big one. Failure to timely report is another one. And just not having the coverage that you think you have. Like I said, so many people think that they have coverage for voluntary transfers, and their particular policy does not cover that. So I'd say those are the top 3 reasons.
Okay, excellent. Well, I see we're right at time. We are going to make this presentation available to all of you on the webinar. You will get a link to the recording of this and the presentation. And we really thank you. Thank you to Grant Page with centrexIT, Cheryl Dunn Soto with Dunn Soto LLP and Franklin Soto LLP and PBO Advisory own Scott Polka. We appreciate all your time. And this was a lot of information. I think all of us have a lot of homework to do to ensure that that we have good practices and policies in place to support our goals to be cyber secure. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.